Okay. Yes, good evening. Good evening. How are you all today?
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening, everyone.
Good
Well,
evening, everybody.
yes. First of all, thank you once again to our hundreds and thousands of, not hundreds of thousands, but hundreds and thousands of viewers over the last, who have joined us for the last few months. Tonight, we have a very informative show, and we want to, first of all, thank our media partners who are Zayed JB Radio in Montserrat, CBN Radio in Virgin Islands, PJWFE in Saba, Channel 82 in Bermuda, and I'm missing somebody. I forgot.
Did you
Live
say?
on YouTube and Facebook.
There you go.
So tonight's show, we are going to be talking about the Caribbean economy, what works for us, and EU unfair. Let me preface that unfair EU blacklisting that works against us. And we are very fortunate tonight to have one of the preeminent persons in the Caribbean who know all about this blacklisting, Miss Marla Dukharan. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And also we have from Cayman Islands a financial professional, Johann Moxam. Thank you for coming on, Johann.
Thank you very much.
And I'll allow Ms. Dukharan to introduce herself to the people of the Caribbean. Not that they don't know her.
Thank you, Mr. Famous. I'm from Trinidad. I'm an economist, but I live in Barbados. I've been here for just over 3 years. And I'm very passionate about the economies, of course, in this region, but also the very unjust, as Mr. Famous just mentioned, very unjust and biased treatment by the EU against all non-white small economies globally, but not just in the Caribbean globally, but there's quite a heavy presence here in the Caribbean and also in the Pacific. And so that's what keeps me up at night. Thanks for having me, by the way.
Thank you. And Johann?
Again, thank you very much for the opportunity to share a platform with Ms. Dukharan. Chris, greatly appreciate the opportunity to participate. And Mishena, nice to spend time with you. I'm a financial services professional born and bred in the Cayman Islands. Based in the Cayman Islands, I'm a former managing director of a Class A bank and trust company, Merrill Lynch Bank and Trust Cayman Limited. I have over 20 years experience in financial services or offshore financial services. And right now I'm the managing partner of a firm called Laneston International Management. I just want to preface what I'm saying. I also sit on the Cayman Islands Monetary Authority Board of Directors, but tonight I will be sharing my views, my concerns, and in no way, shape, or form am I attempting to represent the views of the Cayman Islands Monetary Authority. I'm a concerned citizen who understands the importance of financial services to the Cayman Islands, but also the way that it helps our region and countries that are able to participate. So thank you very much for the opportunity to be here.
Okay. So now that we have that, Ms. Dukharan, could you give us a very brief overview of the economies of the Caribbean, and especially those like Bermuda, Cayman Islands, and BVI that deal with financial services?
Well, we know that the pandemic has hit all of us very hard. all economies except Guyana in this region contracted in 2020, and most continue to contract in 2021. What we're seeing is that many economies are on the upswing right now. And so recording maybe in some cases double-digit growth rates in 2022 and projected to continue to grow in 2022 at that pace. However, don't be fooled when you see 12% growth, 15% growth projected for this year for any country. It doesn't mean that the economy is booming. It means that we're kind of snapping back from the decline that we saw in 2020 and into 2021. Most countries are going to take 2 to 3 years in this region for their economies to recover to the size that it was in late 2019 or early 2020 before the pandemic hit. So in other words, most countries are going to take till 2024. Some will take even longer to get to the point where the size of the economy recovers to where it was in late 2019 or early 2020. And what we're seeing is that the countries that had adopted, that had started to roll out vaccines earlier and have the highest uptake in vaccines, they're the ones that were opening up sooner. So those are primarily the non-sovereign countries, so the overseas territories, the Dutch territories in particular. So they're the ones, you're the ones who started rolling out vaccines earlier and have the highest uptakes in general in the regional context. And so because your economies had reopened, just now I just saw an email from Curacao saying that they've done away with all of their testing requirements to land in Curacao. So these are the countries that are seeing economic activity, especially tourism and travel-related activity, get back up and running, and therefore they're the ones that are seeing their economies recover faster because they kind of started earlier. Of course, as we discussed a little bit earlier, Mr. Famous, Guyana is an outlier. It is the world's newest oil-producing country, and so their growth is well outside of what we typically see in the region. And they are one of the fastest growing economies in the world. So they're an outlier. And there are some countries like Trinidad and Tobago that were in trouble well before the pandemic hit. And so the decline that we're seeing in the Trinidad economy is pretty much unrelated to the pandemic. It was made worse, of course, by the pandemic, but not caused by the pandemic. I would say the same for the Bahamas. They were recovering from the Hurricane Dorian devastation and were hit by this pandemic less than a year after that hurricane hit them. So there were some economies that were already struggling. So I hope that gives you a broad overview that you were looking for.
Yes, thank you. And Mr. Moxam, from your vantage point, what is the overview? What is your overview of the?
Well, I just I want to thank Ms. Dukharan for sharing her views regionally. From a Cayman context, we're very different from a lot of the other islands of the Caribbean because financial services has been our bread and butter. And truth be told, financial services is the equivalent of Cayman's oil. We have a rich history going back 40, 50 years of being a premier offshore financial services center. For us, we've gone through a 2-year sort of lockdown because of COVID, but financial services basically, which is the lead industry, didn't really skip a beat. We were very, very fortunate. Tourism fell away for obvious reasons due to travel restrictions and Cayman putting itself in a bubble. The development boom continued in part, but people were losing confidence with the fact that Cayman was going through a self-imposed sort of shutdown or the bubble as we call it. But financial services has carried the economy and continue to do so during the COVID sort of a pandemic, if anybody ever questioned the importance of financial services in the Cayman Islands, it is without a shadow of a doubt now the primary driver of our economy, and it represents the largest employer of locals in industry. But more importantly, it represents over the last 2 years easily over 78% of the GDP for the Cayman Islands. So our perspective or our situation is very different in comparison to a lot of other countries, whereby we've felt the knock-on effects in other industries, but financial services just kept going that way.
Okay, thank you. So what percentage of your workforce in Cayman Islands is employed in financial services?
I would think last time I saw those
directly
figures,
or indirectly?
Directly, I would go out on a limb and say that workforce is easily 3,500 jobs. The knock-on effects from that, financial services drives the housing market. It drives the entrepreneurial sort of sector as well. Restaurants, bars, all of these sort of accoutrements that you need for professionals to feel that they're in a modern sort of setting. Financial services is more than just 3,500 jobs in straight financial services. When you look at the government agencies that exist to lend support and help shape and guide industry, I would go out on a limb and say financial services probably represents 35% of the workforce in Cayman.
Okay, I'm going to circle back to you, Ms. Dukharan. Yet, a lot of your work was a lot of your early work was on the Tnt Economy. Yet noted earlier that they were challenged prior to COVID. What were, with Trinidad and Tobago being an natural gas oil producing country, why was their economy challenged?
Well, it's interesting the way that you phrase that question. Why was the Trinidad and Tobago economy challenged?
Sorry, I'm a politician.
Given that we are an oil and gas producer, and I think your question should be, why not? Because actually, countries that produce commodities and mining-based commodities are actually predisposed to having an underperforming economy. So it's called the paradox of plenty, or the Dutch disease. Of course, the Dutch have been cured. They no longer have this disease. So it's like a Trinidad disease or Nigeria disease or Venezuela disease. But countries that have natural resource endowments are predisposed to poor economic performance. So you're more likely to perform badly if you have natural resources than the reverse. So that's something that most people who are not from natural resource endowed countries don't really understand. They just assume that because you have all of these resources, you ought to be wealthy and things ought to be performing well in your economy. But that's not actually the case. So that's the core of what explains why Trinidad is an underperforming or an underachieving country or society, even if you want to broaden it. Because we have relatively weak institutions. And because of that, the predisposition of underperformance because of our natural resource endowment has basically ensured that we've performed badly. The countries that have natural resource endowments that perform well are the countries that have strong institutions like Canada, Australia, Norway, or the countries that have conducted institutional reform to strengthen their institutions in the face of the challenges that they encounter as a natural resource producer. So basically what Trinidad did was, every time there was a boom in terms of the oil and gas revenues, what did Trinidad and Tobago do? We spent more. And we spent sometimes even more than we earned, even when we were booming. When Trinidad and Tobago had its highest fiscal revenue ever in I think 2012 or 2013, somewhere around there, we still spent more than we earned from a fiscal standpoint that year. So that just tells you how irresponsible fiscally Trinidad and Tobago is. And that is at the core of why the economy is underperforming, because the government spends more than it earns. Right now, the government is running for the past, I think, since 2012 or 13, has been running what's called a primary fiscal deficit, meaning they're already in deficit before they even pay the interest on their existing debt. And that means you're borrowing to pay the interest on your existing debt. And that tells you that your debt level is unsustainable at somewhere around 90% of GDP. And so that fiscal irresponsibility is at the core of why the economy is underperforming. The government, for example, has crowded out private sector investment and private sector activity. The government is running an overvalued currency. So, for example, the official exchange rate is $6.80 or so TT dollars to $1 US, but the black market rate is somewhere around 8 or 9 TT dollars to $1 US, depending on who you're buying it from and what quantity. So all of these reasons, all at the core of it, however, is our natural resource endowment. That's the core of why we are an underperforming economy.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for that. I know you did extensive work, and I wanted the people of the Caribbean to have an opportunity to hear for themselves from you. Moving on, for smaller islands that are not naturally endowed with natural resources, we have such as Cayman Islands, BVI, Bermuda, some of the Dutch islands to some extent. Barbados, I think we have had to go into financial services as our bread and butter. As Johann had said, that is 35% of their workforce. But I'm going to let you explain. What is blacklisting? Because if I explain, I may use some profanity.
I might as well. So interestingly, the EU has done away with that terminology, blacklisting, but it is what they originally called these lists, gray and black lists of countries that they perceived to be or purport to be non-compliant with their tax guidelines and their AML CFT guidelines. And they prepared these lists. I can tell you, so the EU first published its tax blacklist of 17 non-cooperative jurisdictions for tax purposes in December 2017, and their high-risk third country list having strategic deficiencies in their regime on anti-money laundering and combating the financing of terrorism in 2015. So that's when they started publishing these lists. And interestingly, when I started looking at these lists, because Trinidad appears on both, I just looked at these lists and I thought, there's something not quite right here. Because we know that there are countries like the UK, the City of London, that is well known, and the Netherlands, for example.
You can't say that.
Sorry?
No, I was cracking no joke. You can't say that.
Oh, okay. I mean, these jurisdictions are well known for their extensive money laundering and tax evading activities. Yet I wasn't seeing any of these big, powerful countries like Switzerland even on this list. And I'm looking at the list and I'm thinking, they have these tiny countries whose names you've never even heard of. You have no idea where they are on the map. And, populations of like Cayman, 50, 60,000 people. And I started digging into this list, and you would be surprised to know, maybe not anymore, but not one single country on either of these lists is a predominantly white country.
Sorry, could you say that again?
Not one country on either of the EU's blacklist, whether it's the tax blacklist or the anti-money laundering blacklist, not one country is a white, predominantly white country. Not one of those countries is an EU member or an ally of the European Union. So then I started digging into the methodology as to how they came up with this list. And it's really quite farcical. When you read the methodology, in the first place, they say none of our member states can appear on this list. That's the first thing. We are all exempt. So this is a list where we put other countries who are behaving, or we say are behaving badly. But again, they don't actually identify even countries outside of their membership that are known terrorist financiers. So Saudi Arabia, for example, Russia, for example, never appeared on this list. And so when you really look into the methodology, they exempt countries that are their own members. They also exempt countries based on their economic significance and economic ties with the EU. So if you are a country that the EU is heavily dependent on for trade purposes, investment purposes, or whatever the case is, you are not likely to be blacklisted because you're allies, political allies, economic allies with the EU. So you get exempted again. So then you whittle down further. So we don't put in our own members, we don't put in our friends. So who's left? Who's left are the insignificant countries, the tiny countries that, by the way, the EU doesn't just look at what the global authorities on tax, such as the OECD, say about these countries, or what the global anti-money laundering authorities, the FATF, say about these countries. So for example, you can be completely cleared by the OECD and the FATF. And the EU says, well, in addition to the OECD guidelines and the FATF guidelines, we have our own guidelines. So they have somehow decided that the guidelines put out by the global tax authorities and the global money laundering authorities are insufficient. And they've constructed their own guidelines. And they impose these guidelines on countries unilaterally, meaning that these countries never agreed to be benchmarked or to be to adhere to these guidelines. Whereas you have to be a member of the OECD's program and the FATF's program for monitoring, and you agree as a nation to do this and to be screened by the OECD and the FATF. They don't impose their screening on you. And so the EU, however, has decided that it's okay. It doesn't matter if you're not a member, and it doesn't matter that you've never agreed. We're still going to impose these guidelines on you unilaterally. And if we feel like you don't meet these guidelines, then we blacklist you. And that's in a nutshell what they've done.
Thank you. And when a country is arbitrarily, I'm going to use that word, arbitrarily blacklisted, what does that do to their economies?
Well, first of all, I don't know that I like the word arbitrary, because the word arbitrary, maybe in legal terms, has a specific meaning, but it suggests that it's almost innocent and it's not motivated by any malice. Okay. And that's not what we're seeing here. This is anything but arbitrary. It is deliberate and it's strategic, what they've done. Okay, so I would not necessarily call it arbitrary. But anyway, leaving that aside, what does it do to the economies? Well, in the first place, when the EU decides that they put you on their blacklist, it means you are automatically no longer eligible for any EU aid and support. So for example, you blacklist the British Virgin Islands, and there is a massive hurricane, and everybody is sending supplies and aid. The EU will say, no, we cannot send anything because you're on our blacklist. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, and this is the most important thing right now, I'm sure you've heard of the term de-risking, where large
Banking.
international banks, through which our international wire transfer payments are made, these banks are obligated by the EU to conduct enhanced due diligence on all the countries that are blacklisted. So they ask more questions. They ask for, okay, so this company is sending a wire, like, let's just say here in Barbados, there's a company here that has ordered butter from France. Well, when they're paying for the butter, the bank in France now has to conduct enhanced due diligence, has to ask, who is this company? I want to see who is on the board of directors. I want to know all the beneficial owners of this company. I want to see all of their passports. I want to see all of their, just to send a wire to pay for some butter. So what it means is that trade becomes much more difficult and much more expensive because it takes longer to conduct these financial transactions, and you're charged more money for these financial transactions because the bank's not going to do this enhanced due diligence for free, right? The other thing that happens is that the banks will say, listen, this is so hard. Like, why am I doing business with this little territory that I have to go and do all of this work, and it ties up my AML staff time for maybe $5 million in business a month. This is just not worth it to me. I'm going to close off their account. I don't want to do any business with this bank in that blacklisted jurisdiction. And so that bank then gets de-risked and has to find another bank through which they can open accounts and send wire transfers to. So it affects trade, and that's for exports and imports. And you can imagine it also affects investments. But if you also get cut off from a banking perspective, which actually happened in Belize to the extent that even their central bank had no international banking at one point in time, what happens is that all of your financial services gets locked up. People who have money abroad, companies and individuals who have money abroad, no longer have access to their money. When you want to send remittances to your family back home, when you want to pay your children's school fees abroad, when you want to use your credit card, you're on a trip, everything gets locked up. And so it's debilitating because financial payments and settlement, which is why money is called currency. The original word is, it's like blood. It's what keeps the organism alive, right? And everything gets locked up, and your economy can basically suffer significant negative impacts because of that, because financial payment and settlement is now non-existent. And finally, the other thing it does, but we can't measure this, is that it creates reputational damage. And reputational risk is that, it can make or break an organization, and it can certainly make or break a small economy. When you have a bad reputation, people don't even want to come there on holiday because they have in their head, oh, this is a terrorism financing jurisdiction, or this is a money laundering jurisdiction. And so I don't want to go on holiday there. And then people are going, it's going to raise red flags. And what if my credit card doesn't work? All of these things create massive, unmeasured, undocumented, largely socioeconomic effects that make you wonder whether the EU is doing this deliberately. Now, the FATF, for example, is now doing a study looking at the quote unquote unintended consequences of FATF guidelines and imposition of their guidelines and their blacklisting, because they recognize that what has happened is that some countries that they had put on their blacklist that were de-risked, for example, have suffered these negative consequences. But what it has also done is, because you no longer have access to the international banking system, you then have to rely on cash for payment and settlement. Cash is the easiest way to launder money and to evade taxes. So the FATF realized that what they were doing was actually causing the problem that they were trying to avoid, which is money laundering and financing terrorism. By driving transactions underground, as we call it, into cash, they were creating the same problem that they were purportedly aiming to eliminate. And that's the other effect that I would highlight.
Thank you. You said something. You asked. Well, it was a rhetorical question to some extent. You're wondering if the EU are doing this deliberately, because at the end of the day, when the psyche of black and brown countries are that, oh, those people are criminals, oh, every one of them's down there laundering money or something to that effect. As you said, it makes our economies or makes our countries look less reputable, less people want to invest there. Meanwhile, as we're finding out now, countries such as the UK, for every $1 that's come through here, they had a few billion go through the UK. That's
Exactly.
certifiably illegal money. But that's my take. Johann, you want to chime in quickly?
No, I would just say the summary offered by Ms. Dukharan was first class and captures, in essence, what all of us in the region are going through. But I'm just going to break it down and say this. This is all deliberate. This is all deliberate, in my opinion, and it speaks to placism and classism, because what the EU struggles with is, how do countries that have lots of sand, lots of sun, how is it we are global players in financial services without appreciating the role that we play as facilitators of global finance and the sort of product offerings that are available in the various jurisdictions? And I'm just going to say this, not to be contentious or to be bombastic, why is it the Isle of Man, Guernsey, and Jersey have never been subjected to the level of scrutiny that the Caribbean islands, Cayman, Bermuda, Bahamas, so on and so forth? Now, don't get me wrong, they understand how to play the game well with London, with Whitehall, and they also obviously have figured out how to market themselves and to communicate at an effective level with Brussels and the EU. But they are no different from us in their reliance on financial services, yet they are never the subject of any sort of negativity or blackguarding, for the want of a better Caymanian word, whereby the jurisdiction is threatened and framed up to be some sort of haven for illegal and illicit activities. So that's my view after a number of years, because the way that they frame up the argument is, you would swear that there's $1 trillion in cash sitting in a bank in the Cayman Islands somewhere. The way that the argument gets put forward is nonsensical, but it's to stimulate the sort of view of the region as being persons that are, I guess, of poor character, and just basically natives that have overstepped their mark. Because in the Caribbean, in the Cayman Islands, in Bermuda, we don't do anything different from the Channel Islands, and yet they take none of the flack or abuse or criticism that we take. The question is, why? Look in the mirror and you'll get your answer.
Okay, so that brings me to this point. In 2018, the UK government decided that they're going to put an order in council to force, I use the word force with a capital F, the overseas territories to have a public registers of beneficial ownership. At the same time, the very same time, those crown dependencies weren't going to be forced to do such. Ms. Dukharan, can you speak to that?
Well, I think it's similar motivation, and I think I agree with what Johann just said. that, you know, they know how to play the game. I think that this is driven by competition as well as racism and discrimination. I think that they wanted to find a way to marginalize small countries that do what we do pretty well. And they did not, as he pointed out, treat with Isle of Man, Channel Islands, Jersey, Guernsey, all of them the same way, because they were all part of the UK or the EU. But they want to eliminate us because we're eating part of their pie. The thing is, we are tiny. The combined share of global economic activity that blacklisted countries account for is less than 2% of global economic activity. So they're trying to eliminate the small ones because they want the whole pie. They don't think we deserve any of it. So to answer the question, you know, what are my thoughts on this? It's all the same approach, that there is one standard for them and another for us, and we are not given the opportunity to compete fairly. They see us as competition, and they see us as former colonies that probably don't deserve the opportunity to compete. And so they destroy us before we can make it out of the cot, basically. But I wanted to just read something here for you that the EU members of parliament highlighted the fact that jurisdictions currently on the EU tax haven blacklist account for less than 2% of worldwide tax revenue losses. And this is according to the European Parliament in 2021. Also, this is what they're quoting, I'm quoting them. The purported essence of the tax haven blacklist seems to have been forgotten, as EU members in Parliament pointed out, by calling the EU list of tax havens confusing and inefficient. The Parliament tells it like it is. While the list can be a good tool, member states forgot something when composing it: actual tax havens. This is the EU Parliament criticizing the EU Commission's constitution of this blacklist, saying to them, hang on, first of all, the countries that you blacklisted only account for less than 2% of worldwide tax losses. And furthermore, you forgot to put in actual tax havens in this list. So even the policymakers in the European Union recognize that what they're doing is wrong. They've missed the mark, if that is what they were truly trying to do, to identify tax havens. But you see, the thing is, that's not what they were actually trying to do. If you forget what they appear to be trying to do, and you focus on what they're actually trying to do, they're actually trying to eliminate us. They're actually trying to get us out of the business that they feel is their domain, and we ought not to be playing in that sandbox.
Yes, because this takes me to a situation about 10 years ago in Antigua, where Antigua had somewhat of a gaming industry, but their banks were basically, as you say, de-risked. And the gaming industry was no longer an industry. So meanwhile, you could fly to New York or wherever and do the same thing.
Yep.
So the next question is, I go to these CARICOM conferences, and every year it's okay, who got blacklisted? No. And the CARICOM, they write a letter to the EU saying, no, this is unfair that XYZ country got blacklisted, and we urge you to reconsider. They talk about hiring a lawyer to represent all the CARICOM nations, but it still goes on. And in Bermuda, in 2019, Bermuda was put on the blacklist, not because they found any money laundering here or anything of that, because there was a typo on our annual forms that had to get submitted. A typo. We got blacklisted for 3 to 6 months because of a typo. Couple months later, I think Cayman Islands ended up on a blacklist. And so the question now is, what do we have to do collectively to, I don't say avoid or circumnavigate being blacklisted, if there's anything at all?
First of all, I find it very disappointing that as blacklisted countries and even as regional upstanding citizens, we do not come together meaningfully to push back on the EU. We leave it to individual territories to deal with it on their own. And yes, CARICOM will issue a communique condemning the actions of the EU, but it's not strong enough. I think if all of the countries came together from the Pacific and from the Caribbean and agitated and protested, I think that there is a chance. For example, if you appeal to the United Nations, you appeal to the WTO, somebody is going to hear you. But when each individual little tiny micro state appeals individually, it's noise. It's white noise. So I feel like that's the first thing we need to do. We need to come together as a region, whether or not we're blacklisted, but because our brothers and sisters within the region are blacklisted, we all need to come together and present a unified position to the European Union and to the United Nations, for example, to seek some sort of recourse. And the second thing I think we need to do is take diplomatic action. Why not expel your EU ambassador and say, I'm sorry, this is unjustified. I'm doing everything I can. I have satisfied the FATF and the OECD. And you are not satisfied because you are asking for things that even your own member states don't do. That is unfair. You need to get out of my country. But we don't have the courage to do these things because we're small and we are insecure. Maybe it's post-colonial PTSD. I am not sure. But why are we not brave enough to say this is wrong? You cannot treat me like this and have a presence in my country. Get out.
Thank you.
I like that. I agree with that. That should be the strategy.
As a corollary, I think what's important is that we don't see ourselves as our brother's keeper. Mm-hmm. So what happens is the competition is so fierce that in Cayman, for instance, industry comes together when there's a crisis. Outside of that, it's every man for himself, which is unfortunate. Yes. Now, take that small level of politics with a small p and apply that to, are we really prepared as leaders within the countries, heads of states, to say, listen, we're going to put aside our competitive nature because revenue is all that we care about, because the more revenue you get, the bigger the roads, the more schools, the hospitals, so on and so forth. We need to understand that ultimately, one of the strategies has to be preparing yourself for the eventuality of a legal challenge by having strength in numbers. You can't tell me that Cayman and Bermuda shouldn't be working, for instance, because I do business with Bermuda a lot. That's what I'm saying that. Or the region shouldn't be trying to figure out how we protect our own interests and the industry that provides so much opportunities for our people, but more importantly, revenue, because tourism is really fickle. We've seen that, but the one constant and the one thing that drives other industries is your financial services. But we need leadership that need to humble themselves and appreciate. We will only be able to make sense of nonsense by working together and demonstrating that a unified front is the only option available to us.
Exactly. Yeah.
Anything you want to add, Shana?
No, I completely agree. I mean, it falls right in line with our tagline for the program and the intent that we have, that, through this process of education, that persons start to understand that we are much more stronger, we have more capacity to push up against these double standards that, Marla is so cleverly articulating that exist in the global economy. Because, first it was agriculture, and then they went after financial services, and they will continue basically the press. There's no end game for them until we are out of business. And that's what I think a lot of our viewers need to really appreciate, that is what they're after. They're after the industries, and however we survive after the fallout, is basically on us. So even though they are the administering powers for us as overseas territories, just from a humanitarian standpoint, it's like there's no compassion in here. This is all strictly business, and they're out for blood.
And if I might add, just because I need to leave shortly, the thing is, I agree completely with what Johann is saying, and I feel like there should be some legal recourse that should be pursued collectively. And I just want to read something that the European Parliament issued in a communique in 2021. They said EU member states should also be screened to see if they display any characteristics of a tax haven, and those falling foul should be regarded and listed as tax havens too. So even the EU Parliament is recognizing and acknowledging the double standard that is being displayed by the EU Commission's blacklisting. That tells you that you have a legal leg to stand on, because they have themselves, the policymakers themselves, have acknowledged that we are not applying our own standards to our own member states, and that's not fair. And so if they themselves have recognized that this is unfair, why is it that our countries have not come together, found a law firm that will represent us collectively, and taken them to court over this action? Why is it that we are just sitting, waiting for the next gray list and blacklist to then jump up and down, pass regulatory and legislative amendments, comply, get taken off if we're lucky, and then they change their requirements and you get blacklisted again? Because that's what happens, It's as though we are deer in headlights, and we're blinded, and we're frozen, and we're not able to react collectively. It's quite distressing for me, and heartbreaking to see.
Well, I want to thank you for your expert analysis, and more importantly, thanks for your frankness, because many people who are in positions of influence are afraid to say what you said. Like,
well, I'm not in a position of influence, so I guess I could say whatever.
Oh yes, you are.
So, but I just want to say thank you very much, everyone, for having me tonight. And I think that what you're doing is really important work, highlighting and ventilating these issues and making sure that people understand just how unfair this is and just what the reasons are. It's not that we ourselves are offside and we are non-compliant. We are, but we are being marginalized by the EU that wants to basically have the whole pie and not share it with us. That's in essence what it is. And I just want to say thank you for ventilating this, and good luck with the rest of the show.
Thank you. Everybody, a round of applause for Ms. Marla Dukharan.
Thank you. Bye.
We'll be posting some of your especially the one on Vanuatu on our Facebook page, so people can get a that's a great summation of what the EU has been doing to overseas territories.
Thank you very much, Mr. Famous. Thanks for the opportunity. Have a good
All right,
night,
thank
everybody.
you.
Thank
All right,
you.
good night.
Bye-bye. Good night.